I'm extremely delighted to be here. Thanks so much for having me, and real hats off as well to all of you who've decided to spend some time getting online on your weekend to meet a group of like-minded people. And I'll go into detail in a minute about why I think that's particularly important. But today I want to talk to you a little bit about first steps. So my name is Chris Schrader. I'm a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. I'm actually the youngest fellow ever of the Royal Geographical Society. Today I sit on several boards. I'm the founder of the 24-Hour Race, a student-led movement fighting slavery. I have a few world records under my name, and I've also set a few companies up as well in the tech space. I don't say this to brag, quite the opposite. If I look at myself, even today, I would say I'm not particularly intelligent. I'm certainly not rich. I don't have the looks. So what is it that really helped me get started in life and come up with some of these things that helped me get to where I am? It all starts when I was about 14 years old, back in 2009, as you can see in this photo. I wasn't a really great student. I was probably a C grade student at best. I wasn't a great athlete. I was sort of the kid who would run the hardest at cross country, you know, to the point where at the end I was throwing up and I'd still come in 7th or 8th place, despite giving it my best. An extremely short attention span. I really couldn't focus on anything at once. I was constantly moving on to different interests all the time. And I really wasn't able to connect how anything I was learning in class could potentially, or anything I was learning at all at the time, could potentially connect to my future. And around that time, an event happened that changed my life. And that was the death of a very, very close friend of mine, which is where that article came from with the title. I was 14 years old. My friend died of a very rare genetic illness, so there wasn't much I could do. I wasn't a scientist. I didn't have money to donate. So I thought, what could I contribute in my friend's memory? And the question was sort of floating around my mind. And I was at the time I was in England studying at boarding school, and we were talking about things we would do the following summer, just as a kind of friendly conversation at dinner. And I suggested randomly to a group of friends, why don't we walk across England? And sort of 8 people around the table. And of course, all of them laughed, except one guy, and that guy you can see in this photo on the right. And he said yes. And this is just through a series of coincidences, having the right people around me, having great parental support. Over the next 6 months, we actually planned and trained to do this. I remember after that dinner, we just went to my room, we opened Google Maps, and we basically plotted a route from one end of England back to our school on the other. And we said, okay, great, we've got a route now, all we need to do is training. Of course, that wasn't it. But the point really there was that we didn't know anything that we were getting into. We didn't know what sort of equipment we would need, what sort of training we need. The route itself was obviously not going to be quite as appropriate as we wanted to be on Google Maps. But we took a first step. And once we'd taken that first step, it gave us a next series of challenges. And then we had to kind of take a step into delving into those. But we had no idea what they were until we made that first step. And that to me was a huge shift in the way I thought about things. Instead of worrying about how do I build a company or how do I organize a whole expedition, it was always, what can I do right now, right this second, to bring me one step closer towards getting to a much larger goal. In terms of England, we actually trained 6 months later. We were in, as you can see here, in August. So actually not too far off. I think actually today might have been the day we finished walking across England, something like 12, 13 years ago. Nice little coincidence. But we started walking, and over the course of 2 weeks, we got 600 kilometers across England. And maybe more importantly, we raised something like 200,000 Hong Kong dollars. It just completely shocked me. It was an unimaginable amount of money. And maybe more importantly, we got a lot of press. And orphan diseases, these are really rare genetic conditions you're born with. By definition, they don't affect a lot of people. So awareness is really important in terms of addressing orphan diseases. So I finished that expedition up, and it was an amazing experience, but it wasn't always the most pleasant experience. And I sort of said, okay, that's my taste of endurance done. Those are my expeditions done. And I headed back to Hong Kong to go study at United World College. I was about 2 months into studying at UWC when I got a call from my mum, and she said that a friend of hers was running, this race, and they needed what's called a support mule, someone who carries water, food, that sort of thing, and would I be interested? And bear in mind, at this point, I never run more than 5 or 10 kilometers in my life. But I just said yes. My mom is not a particularly athletic person. I figured her friends weren't either. Boy, was I wrong. So it turned out the race they were talking about was the Trail Walker, the Hong Kong Trail Walker, which is a 100-kilometer mountain marathon across the McLehose Trail. So I found that out. I was like, oof, okay, I'm running 100 Ks, I guess. But it's my mom's friend, so probably going to be walking. And it turned out that her friend was Lucy Marriott, was the world record holder for the fastest mountain marathon runner in Hong Kong on this particular trail. And that particular year, they were going again for the record. They wanted to run it, for perspective, they wanted to run it in under 13 hours. And I think the all-time record is about 10 and a half hours to do this full 100 kilometers through the mountains. So I kind of committed myself to doing this, not the whole thing, but running a significant chunk of it, carrying all their gear. I remember showing up again, it was a case of, I don't really know what to do here. I don't know how you run a mountain marathon, but I'll just start training. And so I did. And I showed up at the start line in a pair of rugby shorts and a rugby shirt. And I think I got some confused looks from the team. Like, okay, is this guy really going to be able to bring us to the finish line? And I got the support backpack on, started running. And 30, 40 Ks later, when I was supposed to stop running, the next support person was missing. So I actually carried on running another 30, 40 Ks. So I'd basically done the whole thing, but I had to stop at around Monkey Hill, which I think is stage 7 or something. So about 70 Ks into it. Monkey Hill does have monkeys, but I was hallucinating at that point. I saw thousands of monkeys around me. So I decided, they decided, okay, it's probably better off he stops. I got picked up by my parents and brought straight to hospital. I was on a drip for a day and kind of not doing too well. And by the time I came back to my senses, I said, okay, I've given it a shot. I've taken that first step into mountain marathons. It obviously didn't go as well as planned, but I kind of like it. So I'll do another one. This time I'll actually train properly though, and I'll figure out the right equipment. And the team actually did get the record, and I think they still have it as the fastest mixed gender team. They ran it in something like 12 and a half hours. So I really had a trial by fire giving that a shot. Again, I didn't really know anything about trail running in Hong Kong, open water swimming, all these different things that you could do. And I never related to my home city as being kind of an outdoors place like that. But I started going out. I'd go out and just go randomly swimming in some direction in Tolo Harbor up in Shek Mun. And I would go up to the mountains, Mount Shan, and just see how far I could run with a bottle of water. And then next time I had a backpack, and it got better and better. And eventually a year later, my very, very same friend came over and we did a sort of 2.0 expedition. 1.0 was in England and the second one was in Hong Kong. Of course, you can't, if you walk across Hong Kong, it's not too difficult. You can kind of do that with your girlfriend on an afternoon. So we decided to do 150 kilometers of running, swimming, and rowing across Hong Kong. Our goal was to do that in less than 24 hours. We ended up doing it in 23 hours and 57 minutes. And we raised another 200,000-300,000 for the same charities, again, supporting these rare genetic illnesses. And at that point, I got to a stage where I was looking to do something a bit more than a competitive race, something a little bit more off the beaten track. I'd taken this lesson, which was, don't worry too much about what's happening tomorrow. Don't worry too much about what's happening next year. Instead, try and be as present as possible and see how you can take one step towards whatever goal it is you have in this day. And just so happened I was connected with a British explorer quite randomly. I mean, I can't even remember how I was connected with him. But we were talking on Skype and I was fascinated by some of his previous expeditions. And he told me on the phone, I'm going to be walking across the Gobi Desert next year. We're looking for a youth ambassador because there's going to be a few TV networks following. Do you want to join? And it was one of these things where, once again, I wasn't too concerned about where it was, what was going to happen. I sort of just said yes, and I'll figure the rest out later, right? Take on one step at a time. And so I got off the Skype meeting and I had to Google search where the Gobi Desert was. Didn't know what the Gobi Desert was. And like, oh my goodness, it's the most extreme desert in the world. We were walking about 2,000 kilometers over several months, but I committed to it. And I committed to it at a very odd time as well. It was the last year of IB. I'm sure a few of you are doing IB here, and some of you will know how intense that is. In fact, I think now looking in hindsight, IB was probably more difficult than studying at Harvard. But I just knew I had to do my last year of school, and I sat my final exam, IB high level biology. And I got out, I got into a taxi, got to the airport, and whilst all my friends were going off around the world to celebrate graduation, I found myself in the middle of the Gobi Desert and started to walk. And it really is a kind of a weird analogy. I think back to the first day in the Gobi with a team of 14 relatively experienced expeditioners, mountain marathon runners. I was by far the youngest and least experienced. I'd never done anything like this. I think the longest camping trip I'd done to this point was about a week. I remember the first day we were supported by these amazing camels, as you can see in this photo. That's actually me with the big blue scarf around my head. We spent 2 or 3 hours packing these camels up. It's actually kind of a difficult art to balance the packs properly. And they're pretty wild animals. They don't want to be around humans, not like dogs and cats. They kind of want to break free and run away. And after a couple of hours of preparing the camels, we started walking, and people's paces were different. Camels were running all over the place. So eventually at lunchtime, our expedition leader sort of pointed on the horizon to what he thought were a group of trees. And he just said, look, make your way there. There's a river with some trees by us where we're camping tonight. Just take your time, and we'll see each other this evening. And it turned out what he was pointing at was a mirage. So everybody walked in different directions, and people ran out of water, going up and down, getting lost. And eventually, I think about 8 hours later, when the sun was setting, we finally got to camp, and we were just sitting down to eat. And just as we were about to start eating, this truck rolls up in the middle of the Gobi, in the middle of nowhere, and out pop 2 extremely drunk Mongolians and armed with rifles and start asking for money. We're not exactly clear what's going on, but a wonderful expedition leader, he kind of, translator kind of approached them and said, convinced them that we were some sort of group of Russian special forces on exercise, probably be better off avoiding us. I don't know how we got away with that, but we did. So finally we're about to eat, and then it rains. I mean, it's never rained that hard in my life. I think it rained for 2 hours in the middle of the Gobi Desert, just pure rain. And of course, none of us had brought raincoats or waterproof equipment, so everyone got soaked, and it was freezing cold. By the nighttime, it was well below zero. And that was just the first day. I mean, we'd walked probably less than 12 kilometers. And I remember feeling like it was the longest day of my life. And knowing that I had, done less than 1% and had the rest kind of to go. And this is where that first step kind of mentality it really comes into effect. So I realized if I focused on what percentage I was through the expedition, I would probably never finish it. And so instead I focused on each day. What could I do to get me through the first day? What could I do? Wake up, pack all my stuff, then I get my cup of tea. That's my little reward. And then I get lunch, and then it's the end of the day and I can read a bit or whatever it was. But breaking down these massive goals and not worrying about where you're going to be in a month or 2 months, but being absolutely present, I think is what helped me successfully cross the Gobi Desert. And sure enough, it took us 2 months, and we started with 14 people, and ultimately 4 people, including myself, walked the entire distance. And everybody survived, no one died, but for various reasons, people left the expedition. And I think a big one was kind of getting lost in the scale of things, lost in the scale of the challenge, and mentally just not being able to cope with that. By the time I got to the end of the Gobi Desert, I really was like, okay, this needs to be my last expedition. I mean, I've done this now over and over. I keep saying yes. I keep taking on bigger and bigger challenges. And we were in a tiny little mining town, which was the nearest place to the other side of the Gobi Desert, which just happened to have high-speed internet. It was on the railroad from Beijing to Ulaanbaatar. So it was dusty Wild West town, and then it had this high-speed internet cafe, which is where we were hanging out. And I was in there, and I got an email from a friend, and he said, I've been really inspired by the Gobi expedition. I have an uncle with multiple sclerosis. I've always wanted to do something about it. And I was thinking of cycling around this lake in Canada. And I knew him. I knew he was a very athletic guy. I knew he was extremely competent endurance athlete. I wrote back to him. I said, mate, why this lake? give me something bigger. And he came back and he just sent me a screenshot of Canada and said, let's cycle across Canada for the speed record. And something like 2 days out of the Gobi Desert, I just said yes. So a year, only 48 hours after saying this would be my last one, I once again committed. And sure enough, a year later, in July 2012, we cycled across Canada for the world record. And we did get the youth record. We cycled about 6,300 kilometers over the course of the month. All of this to say, I took a first step literally in England when I suggested this conversation on the dining table. And then I took a first step to walk across England, and that led to all these different things that put me eventually in the Gobi Desert. If you had told me that that was all going to happen before I started walking across England, or even had the idea, I probably would have dumped that idea, canned it, never looked at it again. It would have been way too intimidating a future. But the point was, you look at one challenge and you deal with that one challenge as it comes your way. And then you focus on the next thing, and then you focus on the next thing. I think there also comes a point in life where you realize you've developed passion and a sense of skill maybe for a particular area. And for me, I had so many students approaching me with their own personal grief saying, hey, how can I make a difference through endurance? And I realized there was an opportunity to give people the taste of endurance and tie it with philanthropy. And so with a couple of friends, we sat down and said, hey, how can we make this accessible to anyone in Hong Kong? And we came up with the concept of the 24-hour race. You run 24 hours in a team of 8 and you fight child slavery. Now, there are lots of stories on why we chose that particular format, lots of stories on why we chose that particular charity. But to jump to the chase a little bit, or cut to the chase rather, we really just believed, we had a sense that this was something people wanted to do. You know, if you spoke to your average teacher in 2010 and said, your students spend their free time running 24 hours, they would have laughed you out the room. And in fact, they did laugh us out the room a lot. And that's what led to it becoming a student-led movement. But we never really thought too much about that. We just thought of a concept we were passionate about, a difference that we wanted to make, and always focus on the next little challenge, which could have been, how do we get our next volunteer? How do we choose a location? How do we get our first team signed up? How do we get our first school signed up? We didn't worry too much about the myriad of items that we had to get through. Instead, we just focused on the one that was in front of us that particular day. And I have to say, it's really important to think about passion, to be a little bit selfish. I would say that's been an underrated philosophy of mine, which is that we're always balancing what we need to be with what we want to be. And we need to be good students, good children to our parents, respectable members of society, but we want to be astronauts. And ultimately, if we go far too much in one direction over the other, that's not balanced. So often we have to figure out how to do both. And I think when you found something that you're passionate about, you get an energy that makes you competitive and makes you better than anyone else at what you do, because you care so much, because you could wake up, as it is now for me, at 4:30 in the morning to give a speech because it's something you care about. And I think that's really, really important when it comes to this day and these next few days. You guys consider, well, what do I care about? Maybe it's a particular hobby, maybe it's a particular skill. And then how do I incorporate that with what society needs? How do I balance what I want with what society needs? And that's something that's always been going on over and over in my head. The 24-hour race was kind of that balance. I love deserts, whatever, but not everyone's going to do that. So what's a challenge that's accessible to anyone? And sure enough, today, the 24-hour race is a global movement. We've obviously been hit just as hard as anyone else by COVID. Actually, we've canceled 9 races this year so far. But some of you have participated in our online events. So we're constantly adapting. We have new challenges all the time, despite being around for over 10 years. The final sort of thing that I kind of want to say, and I'll end over here with a little photo. This is a few months after walking across the Gobi Desert. I actually went to go live with my friend Albert there, who's on the far right, as a nomad in Mongolia. Everything I've done in my life, I've known nothing about. I've been the underdog. I've been the amateur, proudly. The only skill I've had is the willingness to take that first step. And I found that when you take the first step, the only thing you need to focus on is the next one. So this weekend, you're going to have a really unique opportunity to meet extremely motivated, extremely interesting students, most importantly. You're going to have the opportunity to learn from some great speakers. And I encourage you, don't worry too much about what you get out of this in your CV, what happens next week, how you're going to prepare for classes or homework. Just be absolutely present. Try and make that network. Thinking back to every great thing I've done, probably the cornerstone of that has been partnerships, whether it was walking across England with my friend, whether it was the expedition team in Mongolia, whether it was the founding team of the 24-hour race. So really try and cultivate those relationships this weekend. Try and learn, don't be scared, interrupt speakers through the Q&A dialogue, you know, and get their time, get them afterwards. If they've said something interesting to you, pull them aside. I'm sure they'll give you your time, and make sure that you absolutely squeeze this lemon for all of its juice. And the most important thing I'd say as a final note is your goal in the next few days and in the next few years, I think, is really to fail. And I'll end with this little analogy, which is this joke you might have heard before. Michelangelo is sculpting his very famous statue of David, and someone approaches him and asks him, hey, how do you make such beautiful sculptures? It must be really difficult. To which his response is, he says, no, it's not difficult. All I do is chip away parts of stone that aren't David. And I think that's a really great analogy for failure. We learn far more about ourselves when we get things wrong, or at least we're willing to take that step to get things wrong. We learn about what we don't like, what we do like, and what we aren't good at, as just as much as what we are good at. So don't feel like you need to hold yourselves back. Get to know as many people as you can, and have an absolutely amazing weekend. Thank you very much for listening to my little speech here.